Alright guys, welcome back to class. I think yesterday we moved beyond the definition aspect of the various um, frameworks to an actual schema that helps us understand how the interplay of exit costs versus exit cost thresholds determine different kinds of outcomes that we tend to see playing out in the international system. So we noted that an exit cost threshold is that level of exit costs beyond which a player cannot endure the exit. It sets a state's limit for the costs it is willing to bear in order to get or hold on to something that the other state has or wants. So I think it's fairly flexible to help us understand that anytime you have a bilateral dispute emerging, anytime a challenger that places a demand on a particular target state initiates any kind of demand, we've noted that it is not usually the case that the target will every time cave into the kind of demands that are placed. You may have levels of interdependence wherein for both the challenger and the target their economic interaction doesn't mean much. So for them, the exit costs or the cost of removing themselves from that relationship hardly come close to their threshold. So they have plenty of buffer, as it were, to deal with contestation. And these are situations that are mirrored in the real world when states decide to just simply choose use of force. So when you see examples around you where states have chosen the use of force, sometimes prolonging use of force for more than several months into years, it's fairly understandable that they would be somewhere in quadrant 1, where you take any example, and I'm sure the data will validate this observation that their economic interdependence was hardly close to the level of actual pain that they can endure. For them, the relationship was not that important, and therefore the choice of use of force gets manifest in terms of what plays out in the real world. Exit cost threshold is a function of 3 factors. Again, that's interesting to note. So when you have states initiating some kind of demand, there could be a period of bargaining. It may not be necessarily an immediate period of caving in. The caving in might actually come once the states reach that threshold. So there would be a period of bargaining. There could be a period of limited kind of conflict. When for both the challenger and the target, if you recollect, the third quadrant that we had mentioned, third quadrant places both states in a situation where their exit costs exceed their threshold, right? So it is not that at that particular point in time, whatever the challenger demands, it is not necessary that the target has to cave in, knowing fully well that the challenger is also in a vulnerable position. So there they might be contesting the demand to the extent that they can hold out. And of course, quadrant 4 was where we saw the actual playing out of the liberal interdependence argument. And what is the liberal interdependence argument? That trade leads to peace, that more trade, more investment eventually creates conditions which constrain states from choosing use of force. So when you look at the fourth quadrant, any challenger knows fully well that for them the cost of exiting that particular relationship is much higher than what they can endure. That doesn't mean that states don't start placing demands on other states. I mean, irrespective of that, it might be a situation that requires them to place some kind of demand, but usually in this case the target is very well in a position to push them back, right? Because for them, if you remember, the horizontal line for the target was their threshold. For them, these points are much below the threshold, and therefore they would try and push back the challenger and make sure that the challenger is not able to execute the kind of demand that they wanted to place on the target. The exit cost threshold for both of them is a function of the value of the demand being made by the challenger. So if somebody is demanding something related to a 2% tariff situation, a 7% tariff situation, it would be reacted differently. If somebody is demanding something more serious, for example, the kind of constitutional changes that another state is supposed to make based on what I try and tell them, that would be responded to with another degree of response. And if somebody is making an outrightly different and maybe unacceptable claim relating to possibly how maps are drawn or how territories are shown, then that will elicit a different kind of reaction. So it's fairly understandable that your threshold would be a value of the demand which is being made. Also, it would be a function of the costs of escalating to a militarized conflict. For a 2% tariff, I'm very well sure that they are fairly aware that the other party will not get into a warlike situation for a 2% tariff. Maybe protests around the way some maps are printed, maybe for that also nobody is willing to get into a militarized conflict. Maybe the conflict only comes in a situation where there is an actual change as far as control of territory is concerned. So even there we can understand that the exit cost threshold is the function of the cost of escalating to a militarized conflict, which in most cases states are able to gauge, right? And the third, the probability that the challenger or the target will be successful in the event of a high level conflict. Again, this is not a given. Nobody thought that the Russia-Ukraine crisis will play out the way it has played out. I mean, you had strategic experts who were sort of giving maybe a fortnight deadline for when Kiev would cave in, and we know how many fortnights have passed. So there is always that probabilistic element in how states would assess the fact that whether the challenger or the target will actually be successful in the event of a high level conflict. And I am sure if you look at other examples also, this resonates. The way the response began after October 2023, nobody probably thought that it would meet the kind of resistance it did until 2025, and then they had to work out some kind of a situation which was acceptable for both. So I think exit cost thresholds being a function of these three factors, it's important to bear in mind. We had then gone on to also understand the operationalization of interdependence, looking at an escalation equilibrium. There are three equilibria which are possible, and this is the Crescenzian framework that we are discussing, a framework that was put forward by Mark Crescenzi, where he felt that escalation usually arises in situations where both the challenger and the target don't find the economic interaction or interdependence meaningful enough or valuable enough for both. The cost of exiting the relationship is much, much lower than their threshold. So you can think of n number of examples that reflect this kind of a dyadic setting. A country usually trades with multiple trading partners. Not all trading partners are equally important to the country, and not all trading partners vice versa are important to the counterpart as well. And there are some partnerships which are important and which would then fall into one of those quadrants when we assess the impact that economic interdependence has on their behavior. In quadrant 2 and quadrant 3 reflect bargaining equilibrium, as we said. In quadrant 2, it presents in a way, if you were to look at the kind of worries that neo-realists presented, quadrant 2 reflects those worries, right? So using a liberal interdependence framework, we are also factoring in the worry that neo-realists had in mind. What was their worry? Their worry was that, okay, trade relations might be important, investment might be important, but at the end of the day, investment and trade is relatively important for one actor more than the other, in which case one of the actors is able to bargain or make the other state vulnerable. And so whenever the liberals would say that trade and investment are good as far as averting war is concerned, they would say that but it still leads to vulnerability, and ultimately the vulnerability can only be resolved by their version that interest defined in terms of military capability, and that is the only way to resolve even situations of vulnerability. That's not how liberal interdependent scholars would see. They would see that as the playing out of a certain kind of equilibrium that is also possible, wherein the challenger in this particular case is comfortably placed. His exit costs are well within the limits of that vertical exit cost threshold, but for the target, he is in a vulnerable position. And therefore, why is it called a bargaining equilibrium? Because the challenger in this situation is able to extract what he demands from the target and he's able to get it. This reflects that kind of a situation. Of course, the challenger might be vulnerable also when you look at quadrant 3, and the target, being aware of it, might enter into a bargain, might decide to cave in, might not decide to cave in. It is still called a bargaining equilibrium. It might result in some kind of limited contestation, but quadrant 3 reflects situations when both of them feel vulnerable in that particular relationship. And quadrant 1 is the fulcrum on which a liberal interdependence logic rests. Quadrant 4 is the fulcrum on which a liberal interdependence logic rests, which is that interdependence would always constrain states from taking military action because it places costs on their choice of action. That is why it is called as a constraint equilibrium. Now, in terms of I think the quadrants that were fairly well explained yesterday, so I need not go over it. It basically explains the same thing in terms of quadrant 1, neither state being sufficiently interdependent, therefore you have escalation, conflict. Quadrant 2, you have bargaining because the target is interdependent but challenger is very comfortable. Quadrant 3, both states are sufficiently interdependent and therefore it depends on the value of what is being demanded, the probability of, will it get into a military conflict, will a 2% tariff, will a demand for printing something get into a so then the target would also think that, okay, that guy is also vulnerable, let me resist, let me also push back, and then it arrives at some kind of a bargaining kind of an outcome. And quadrant 4, challenger is highly interdependent, target is very comfortable, and therefore it, as I mentioned, it presents a constraint equilibrium. Okay, I think we had to go through the definitions, and I'm sure we would have covered it thematically in our narration, but just to make sure we haven't missed anything, the relationship between a state's actual exit costs and its threshold is what determines whether economic interdependence affects its strategy with respect to political conflict. I think that is the basis of what we are studying as far as a liberal interdependence logic is concerned. We identify 3 equilibria, and we also worked out how it actually plays out in real life, in the real world. The first, when a challenger's exit costs are greater than its threshold, but the target's costs are less than its threshold, you have a situation where the challenger is deterred from making any kind of demand, which is why it is called as a constraint equilibrium. Here, the challenger is severely constrained by the economic relationship, and this is the argument which is compatible with the overall logic of the liberal interdependence school, that economic interdependence reduces conflict because the exit cost that the challenger faces can prevent it from initiating a demand that leads to conflict. The second one, when the target's exit costs exceed its threshold, the challenger can make a demand. In such situations, if you mind map it to quadrant 2, the target will usually comply. This is where we have a bargaining power equilibrium, where the target's level of interdependence affords the challenger some kind of bargaining power, and here the costs of exit for the target allow the challenger to induce the target to agree to its demands. The third one, when both players, their exit costs are less than their exit cost thresholds, this is when conflict escalates. This is what is called as an escalation equilibrium, or alternately as a crisis equilibrium. And here the use of economic tools of persuasion fail and military conflict ensues. I think we had explained this ad nauseum, so I wouldn't belabor on it. Let us see the first case study that we had just begun to discuss, and which was a constraint equilibrium. Now again, what are the characteristics of a constraint equilibrium? A constraint equilibrium basically forces a challenger not to escalate the situation into something serious, right? That's the basic sum and substance, that the challenger feels constrained. That is why it's a constraint equilibrium. Now, in this particular situation, the case study that we chose is reflective of a real world situation. You are looking at a temporal context of 1980s. You are looking at a spatial context of US South Africa relations. The relationship was fairly important to the South Africans, as we mentioned, that 1/5 of South Africa's trade was with the US. So, if the US decided to simply put a full stop as far as embargoing or sanctioning trade from South Africa was concerned, they could have directly taken a swipe at 1/5 of South Africa's export to the US. Fairly sizable. If they had done that, they wouldn't have lost more than 3% of their total trade as far as their trade with the rest of the world was concerned. However, why this is a constraint equilibrium is because the US never threatened to exit this most salient dimension of the economic relationship. Ostensibly, the US, as Europe, wanted to put an end to the abhorrent practice of apartheid, right? When you start looking at human beings as being different based on race, that just begins to sort of show a very abhorrent kind of thinking, and that had to be put to an end. What were the ways to do that? You could proscribe a country by using hardcore sanctions, but yet what we find in reality was the impact of US sanctions on the South Africans was bare minimum, right? And I think in terms of the two major sanctions they put, in one occasion the impact per capita on South Africans was a few cents per person. That was the cost, hardly any to make anybody feel the pain of punitive action. And in another case, roughly it was about $17 per person, right? So in this particular case, why did the US not choose to use its superior economic weight to impose the political demand on South Africa? And this is where the conversation begins to be interesting when we look at quadrant 4, which is basically what tells us that there was some kind of a constraint on the US. What might that constraint have arisen from? We'll look at what might be the market structure that the Americans were faced with. What was it that they were trading with the South Africans? So is there any aspect of asset specificity? Some of the categories that we discussed previously. Why did the US continually veto UN sanctions for mandatory sanctions? UN resolutions, I'm sorry, for mandatory sanctions? Why did the US never institute an embargo on South Africa's most valuable exports? And that is what helps us understand what might have been the exit costs for the US, which certainly was above their tolerance level, right? So for their exit cost threshold, if you remember the vertical line, this was coming much farther than what they could tolerate in terms of exiting the relationship. So what might that have been? And as I mentioned, it was a straightforward decision that they could make in terms of hitting 1/5 of their exports and harming not more than 3% of their own trade, but they never went on to do that. The United Nations, the European Community, and even the United States imposed economic sanctions of various degrees upon South Africa in protest of apartheid, but with very little success. Again, that just goes on to show when we start with this example and when we sort of feed our curiosity with current examples of how different economies are being able to reach a position of strength, when you look at a certain kind of market structure today, which is discussed in the context of rare earth supplies, when we look at a certain kind of discussion today on asset specificity associated with maybe production of rare earth magnets, how is it that these supply chains get consolidated, and what kind of market structure do they then begin to present, that these situations become quite realistic, right? So this example was in the context of the 1980s. None of these actors were willing to use punitive sanctions that could have actually hurt the South Africans in terms of some kind of signaling. There was no state or institution that ever imposed a comprehensive ban on what was being exported from South Africa. And the reason why that ban would have hit the South Africans hard was that over 75%, over 3/4 of their forex earnings were primarily the result of these kind of sales. So if you really wanted to hit them, you could actually bring them to a halt by making sure that you hit 75% plus of their forex earnings, but this did not pan out in that manner. As I mentioned, two sanctions that were applied by the United States against South Africa during the apartheid era resulted in an annual per capita cost of 8 cents, right? 8 cents per person. I mean, how much that would have hurt them to, even understand maybe the kind of protest that was being made is for anyone to guess. And of course, another sanction that was roughly about $17.19. This was what was imposed as punitive action. The reason why everyone hesitated to do that is where we sort of talk of the asset specificity and the market structure argument. South Africa has the world's largest known deposits of chromium, manganese and platinum, despite the fact that it occupies less than 1% of the world's land surface, right? So when immediately you start applying frameworks like market structure, you begin to understand that, despite the fact that they just occupied 1% of the world's land surface, they possessed nearly 80% of the kind of material we are discussing as far as asset specificity is concerned. In 1983, not only did South Africa possess over 77% of the reserves for these minerals, in terms of market structure, South Africa happened to be the largest supplier, followed by the second largest supplier, which was the Soviet Union, right? And if you know the context of the 1980s and if you know the context of the Cold War, it then begins to become clear why the US or why the Europeans would not have initiated any kind of serious sanctions to proscribe behavior associated with the practice of apartheid. Why these minerals were essential? Chromium and manganese are essential to the production of steel. Platinum is used as a catalytic agent to refine petroleum, to reduce automobile emissions. So again, you'll have to keep in mind that large segments of industry depended on the supplies of these minerals, and these minerals were considered essential not just to the US but to Europe as well. So I think this gives us a fair sense that even if you recollect, maybe 3 lectures, 4 lectures ago, we had discussed the fact that when we were looking at some of the measures associated with interdependence, and we had discussed measures like fraction of trade to as a ratio of total economic output, we had mentioned that it has certain drawbacks, that even if it represents large trade, maybe the large trade may not be of that much value, but sometimes even if the value of trade is of a smaller value, little trade might also mean something which is quite important, right? So that was one of the weaknesses that we had discussed at that time when we were looking at measures relating to economic interdependence, and this basically tells us that. So if you were just looking at trade data, US trade with South Africa, roughly 3% of its total trade, then the kind of measure that you would have had would not have given you the real picture. That is when these frameworks of market structure and asset specificity become important. Market structure was that you're dealing with a monopoly supply or a duopoly supply, given the fact that the second major supplier was the Soviet Union. And even with a duopoly supply, I mean, virtually if 80% of the reserve is with South Africa, is basically a monopoly supply, and even your secondary supplier happens to be your biggest adversary. So that was not a market structure that was conducive for the Americans to use any kind of serious sanction. And when you look at asset specificity, again, it becomes clear that it was not that these assets could be easily replaced by other kind of material. There were certain uses to which chromium was being put to. There were certain uses which manganese had, similar to the examples we now have when we talk of rare earth magnets, etc. I mean, it is not that rare earths are absolutely rare. It is just that over a period of time, different countries have been able to consolidate the supply chain of rare earths. So at one point in time, Australia would have been your biggest rare earth supplier. At another point in time, the Americans would have been your biggest suppliers of rare earths. At some point in time, Malaysia was an important supplier of rare earths. But all of these countries eventually would have neglected this sector. Why? Because it's capital intensive. You need to mine too much of land in order to get a little bit of whatever is the mineral you're looking for. So to that extent, you have to make it so capital intensive, doesn't generate jobs, and therefore why would you want to invest so much of capital? And somebody else decided that, well, this works for me in terms of some kind of strategy to consolidate my supply chain, because I foresee that rare earths would become indispensable for the production of various kinds of commodities, and therefore they did it, right? So it's a similar argument which is made here in terms of asset specificity, that at that point in time these were important to the reduction of automobile emissions. These were important as catalytic agents. These were important in the production of iron and steel, and therefore there was a certain kind of asset that was not easily substitutable, right? The reliance of the United States on imports for at least nearly 80% of its chromium demands throughout post-World War II was something that dictated the kind of market structure and asset specificity that the US was dealing with, right? So even in terms of value, it would have been under 3% of its total trade, but you're looking at 80% of its demands were primarily being met by this one supplier, right? And this was happening through an extended period of post-World War II. So you're looking at the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the 80s, which is being discussed currently. Manganese imports again represented almost the entirety of US consumption that was happening, and platinum imports varied from anywhere between 80 to 90%. So again, when you talk of market structure, you are able to get maybe one level of clarity that even little trade could be valuable trade, right? Even if in ostensible nominal terms that's a small number, when you actually look at the proportion of what you are importing from a particular country being so overwhelmingly large, it becomes clear that the Americans would not have wanted to present the target with any kind of serious challenge, which is where they have this kind of constraint coming up. Finally, I'm sorry, the subhead here says the United States and the rest of the world would be unable to produce enough of these minerals to satisfy its own demand in the event that the South African supply was not available. I mean, of course, this is a corollary of what we are discussing, that if 80% of what you buy comes from them, if 90 to 100% of what you buy, another category of manganese, comes from them, and if platinum, roughly 90% of all your demand comes from them, it is understandable that if the South African supply was anytime interrupted, it would have created serious problems for the Americans, thereby inducing the constraint which led to the constraint equilibrium playing out, right? Finally, the third factor driving up the exit costs for the US was the lack of substitutability for these minerals, right? The fact that there is a certain kind of an asset we are talking about, besides the market structure, there is a certain kind of an asset which was not substitutable, is what makes this relationship more imperative for the Americans. And while these potential exit costs for South Africa were low, the value that the South African government placed on maintaining its domestic policies was pretty high, and therefore you have a scenario where we find that the South Africans, they faced exit costs which were much below the level of pain they were willing to face. For them at that particular point in time, and that was the historical reality of that period, that for them maintaining their domestic policies was what they considered important. So it presented a situation very neatly depictable as being a challenger versus a target situation, where the challenger faced some kind of a constraint in dealing with the target state. In terms of the equilibriums and how they translate to some kind of actions in the real world. So if you are facing a constraint, it's fairly evident that usually the constraint would force the challenger. If you look at the strategies for the challenger, usually the constraint might force the challenger not to make a demand. Even for some reason they were to make a demand, the target would easily push it away, right? The target would be in a position not facing that kind of pain to simply reject the challenger's demands, and therefore it plays out as a constraint equilibrium. In terms of the exit cost threshold, which is denoted by the E star challenger, basically the exit cost threshold for the challenger was much lower than the exit cost. If you look at the other way, it makes more sense. The exit costs for the challenger were much higher than the pain that they could endure, whereas for the target, the exit costs were much lower than their exit cost threshold. Case 2, the way bargaining power operates. As I mentioned, bargaining usually gets reflected in two of your quadrants, quadrant 2 and quadrant 3 if you recollect. And so even when in these kind of situations you are able to make a demand, the challenger would, the target would comply, thereby helping you meet your demand. Or if the target rejects, you find that it would create those low conflict kind of scenarios, basically encompassed in different levels of bargaining, as the case may be, whether it is quadrant 2 or quadrant 3. And escalation equilibrium, the challenger makes a demand, target rejects it. Why? Both of them don't feel that the relationship is sufficiently important, and this of course means that you end up creating escalation or conflict in these scenarios. I think these scenarios broadly, of course, every theory, every kind of explanation would have some limitation as far as evidentiary value is concerned, but I think broadly when you look at events around you, whether it concerns tariffs being imposed on another country and initially the country complying, or it concerns tariffs being imposed on another country and now the country resisting, so you have different levels of bargaining that are playing out, or you have dyads for which their bilateral economic relationship is hardly important for each other, and therefore you find that escalation is easily the outcome, or maybe some kind of bargaining or low level contestation is the outcome. We've discussed a case that helps us understand a constraint equilibrium. How about discussing a case that helps us understand bargaining equilibrium, right? And in this, like I mentioned yesterday, it is not that in terms of role play you always have fixed roles, that the US will always be a challenger and it's some other country who will be at the receiving end. For a bargaining equilibrium, if you think of the late 1980s, and I would jog your memory to 1989, the year in which the Tiananmen Square massacre took place in Beijing. The Tiananmen Square massacre was an instance which got the Chinese a lot of criticism. The Chinese government was criticized for the very high-handed use of force against students who were protesting in Tiananmen, which is like a downtown site in Beijing. They were protesting various things. The mainstream narrative suggests that the students were demanding for democracy, democratic rights, more freedoms, but the mainstream narrative doesn't really reflect even other underlying reasons why the protests converged in Beijing, and it had to do with a certain inflationary pressure at that time, which the Chinese were facing, right, as a result of the economic reforms which had been rolled out in the 80s. There was a certain kind of inflation which was hitting China badly. So the protests were a mix of different agenda items, and the response to that was pretty high-handed in terms of use of ammunition, helicopters, battle tanks on your domestic territory against your own people, and this resulted in different kind of sanctions being imposed by the international community. And one reference that is made is to the US use of the Wassenaar sanctions at that point in time. So the Wassenaar sanctions were an effort by the US to curtail the export of dual use technologies to China. 1989, it would have hit China really hard if export of dual use technologies was imposed in a completely watertight manner. Why? Because they had begun to experiment with economic reforms. Economic reforms had just been rolled out in 1978. 1980s, they were into their second wave of reforms, experimenting with liberalizing their economy, experimenting with opening up different parts of the economy to foreign institutional investors, experimenting with different foreign companies coming, investing, processing, and then exporting final products to different destinations. So if at that time somebody had a watertight case to completely ban export of dual use technologies, we wouldn't see China where it is today, right? Dual use technologies can be anything, right? A road can have dual uses, right? A road can have a use as some kind of a bimedia that connects a rural center with an urban center. It's meant for transportation of people and logistics. But a road can also be used as a landing strip for fighter aircraft. So there's a dual use for anything, right? So when you enforce something like a dual use restriction, if you really impose it in a watertight manner, mind you, it is such a fluid interpretation. Anything can have a dual use, right? A pen can have a dual use. I can use it to write, and therefore possibly when you look at some restrictions which are there at airports, that you cannot carry metallic objects beyond a certain length, there might be a reason for that, right? That it could be sufficiently capable of being used as a weapon. That's the reason why these kind of rules allow maybe up to a certain extent you can carry things. So dual use means if implemented in the right spirit, you can really put a full stop on another actor. But was it the way it played out when you look at the actuals of the Chinese moving from production of soft manufactures like bags, belts, toys to electronic products? In the first instance, maybe low-tech electronic products like radio frequency toys, maybe keyboards, etc., and subsequently to maybe higher-end technological products, including today the kind of chips that Huawei makes, their own chips for their own phones, which are able to compete in some nanometer category with world leaders as far as manufacturing chips is concerned. So all of this, when seen in totality, means that somewhere in this particular case, you have a situation where the challenger is able to extract a bargain from the target, right? In this particular case, the Chinese, given the fact that 1989, 1990s presented also a very interesting economic opportunity to the Americans, the fact that American industries at that time would have seen what aspects of imposing a watertight sanction on the Chinese. They would have seen the fact that they would be cut off from a population of nearly 1 billion at that point in time, right? Of course, it was under 1 billion. So they would have seen that if I do all of this, if I go hardcore on imposing these kind of watertight restrictions that proscribe any kind of interaction, then I am cutting off a foreseeable market for my own products. I am cutting off possibly investment prospects for my own companies. I mean, mind you, the logic of capitalism is not forced onto any company, right? When companies in the US decide that it's more profitable to manufacture elsewhere, it is their choice, right? They are looking at the cost benefit of relocating production. They are looking at the cost benefit of moving investment outside their country. And so when all of these factors would have been taken into consideration, somewhere they would have balanced the kind of continuation of ties, economic ties with China. And the Chinese, on their part, would have demanded what? They would have also demanded market access, the fact that we are able to produce monitors cheaply, we are able to produce electronic products, televisions, printers, computers, all of this cheaply. And we would like market access, and they got market access, right? And for the Americans, it was a way of driving their consumption and maintaining certain standards that they've always maintained. So, in the US, consumption accounts for the biggest contribution to their overall GDP. And that is the reason why every time Apple launches a new iPhone, you find that people, for some weird reason, are willing to stand in long queues, maybe sometimes even wait overnight till the store opens to get their hands on the latest phone, which is possible because that phone is priced at a certain level, made affordable because it comes from China, right? Now, when you look at the kind of changes which are happening, of course, it's very difficult to tell how the current round of tariffs eventually affects this kind of working equation that they have. But certainly for a very reasonable period of time, when we look at Tiananmen Square massacre, post Tiananmen sanctions, eventually China-US relations, did they become important economic partners for each other? If so, was the relationship only important to the Chinese? If not, how was it important for the Americans? And then you begin to understand that the Chinese somewhere had been able to extract some kind of bargains despite the kind of sanctions that they were subject to in consequence of the Tiananmen Square incident, right? So I think, yeah, in terms of this box chart, let's see if we've missed anything out. So bargaining power is a situation when the challenger can safely make demands. So you're basically looking at situations where even if there are some kind of restrictions on export of dual use technologies, even if somebody is threatening you that you've been found wanting as far as implementation of human rights is concerned, etc., you are still able to extract something from the target. Usually the bargaining power equilibrium, if you again mind map to the quadrants that we discussed, quadrant 2 and quadrant 3 in the top half of our schema, usually bargaining is associated with low level of contestation. It is associated with non-militarized conflicts. It is usually associated with challenger making demands, target acquiescing to that demand if you're looking strictly at quadrant 2. Quadrant 3 would be prolonged contestation, prolonged kind of bargaining. And the example that we laid out, China and the US economic relationship, in which the Chinese as challengers were able to sort of deal with the restrictions on technology transfer that existed on the Chinese. And in this particular case, China was able to demand and get dual use technology transfers from the US despite a ban on military technology transfers imposed on it after the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989. China uses the threat of refusing access to its huge domestic market as a bargaining tool, and it was fairly believable, and it is something that even today is fairly believable in terms of the kind of market size that China presents, not wanting to maybe annoy a possible seller to the benefits of exploring or that particular market. So on that note, I'll bring today's discussion to a close. We'll take up escalation equilibrium when we meet in the next class.